Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred, and I'm so happy to have you back with us in our home, in our van here in somewhat chilly Colorado today. You might see some of our friends, our little flies flying around. We've had a lot of flies get into the van, and I can't kill anything, so um, we just kind of try to shoo them out, or we live with them. So you might see them as the video goes on. This video is about this question of, can our personalities change once we do inner healing? And the short answer is yes and no, but I'll explain what I mean by that, and I'll give specific examples of how I believe that my personality has changed, and yet aspects of my temperament, some might say, or being have not changed. So stay tuned for that. And just really quickly before that, I would like to give a shout out. There was one person who gave a gift this last week on the last video. And so I would love to shout out Karen Tisdale. Thank you so much for your gift. And I'll go ahead and read Karen's comment. This was about the last video that I made about a review of the book Golden Child by Lawrence Malcolm. And Karen says, "Thanks, great summary. Thanks for bringing this interesting book to my attention. Love the discussion on boundaries, the magic, and calling out behavior that is not valuing me, and still seeing the true loving essence of the other, and choosing where boundary is to ensure my parts are safe. As a child, I had to shut out my parents to be safe, and then I got extremely isolated. IFS and your offerings are so healing and liberating. Some of my parts are excited to explore their choices and variety of boundaries that are possible. As a child, I had no choice about anything." Yes, so well said, Karen. Um, I love that you pointed out kind of the all and, right? Of it's not either or, it's it's this and this and this and this simultaneously. And also for pointing out that as children, we are dependent on our parents for belonging and for survival. And so a lot of times it can be really, really difficult that either we choose belonging and sacrifice our authenticity, or we choose authenticity and sacrifice our belonging and our safety. And especially when it's the person or persons and our parents who are responsible for our care are the ones who are dangerous or unsafe to us, it can be a really confusing time for our young parts, and they can take on so many burdens around that. So I love the hopefulness at the end of your comment around, as an adult with an adult body and mind with which our capital S self can go out in the world and be curious, like you said, about what are the different ways that I can hold both value for the other and value for myself, and protect the harm that someone's protected parts are doing on my vulnerable parts, and what are creative ways, right, that I can do that. So thank you for your comment and for your gift. And if you would like to give a gift, on the right hand side of your screen under the video, there should be a heart with a dollar sign that is where you can give a gift. I think it says thanks, or if it's not there, you might see three dots and you press on that and you'll see it. But all gifts go to support basically the overhead of my website, so that I can offer all of my self-paced courses, workshops, worksheets, and meditations as free gifts to anyone who comes there and wants them. Um, and if you give any amount, I will shout out your comment and or answer your question. Okay, so without further ado, today I would love to talk about this question. So my good friend Hallie, so my self-led bestie, um, and I were talking about this because I was getting in touch with how my system has changed, in particular around perfectionism and people pleasing, and how who I kind of used to be is not how I am now after healing. and how a lot of those things are perceived in culture as my personality, right? I'm the perfectionist, I'm the people pleaser. And as my parts have healed and been able to unburden a lot of those really extreme burden strategies to protect me as they feel safe, um, I show up in the world in a different way, right? And so I got really curious, and Hallie said too, oh, this was a great topic for a video, right? Can our personalities change as we heal? And so I didn't have time to make a handy dandy PowerPoint for you, but I do have lots of notes on my phone about this. So the first thing I did was I wanted to look up the definition of personality. There might be several, but this is from the Britannica, which reminds me of the, Encyclopedia Britannica back in the day that people would go around selling big volumes of books that essentially was the internet before the internet. But so in the Encyclopedia Britannica, uh, defines personality as this: personality is the unique collection of relatively stable patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior that distinguish one individual from another, encompassing their inherent and acquired characteristics that influence their interactions with their environment and others. It forms an enduring configuration that is unique to an individual, shaping their personality and influencing their life outcomes. But I have a part that doesn't like when people in the definition of a word use the word, right? So when it says it shapes their personality, I had a part that went, huh? Okay, so there's lots of things in here. One is that it says it's a relatively stable pattern according to this definition, and later it talks about how it's an enduring configuration. Um, I do like these words pattern and configuration, and it kind of also there's another word, maybe it was configuration, but that kind of denotes a little bit that there's layers, right? That there's like lots of different influences that are coming in, and it kind of names two. It says encompassing their inherent and acquired characteristics. Okay, so according to this definition, it's like there's this combination of what a lot of people would call nature and nurture, right? The inherent qualities we're born with, and kind of the patterns and qualities that we develop from our nurture, from our environment, right? And it's putting them together, and it's saying a combination of these two is what makes up personality. So what I would suggest in my experience is that our nature doesn't change. Kind of our temperament, or I've talked a lot recently about neurosensitivity. What I've observed in myself is that my sensitivity has been there from as long as I can remember, and by reports from when I was a baby, um, to this day, and has not changed. And my parts have explained that it's not going to change, that that's just who they are, and it's not a bad thing, right? So there are certain aspects of what people would describe as personality in temperament, right, that we're born with that I don't think change, right? That some of us have different capacities. We might have different, of course, those can change as well, but we have kind of like a baseline of capacity as far as sensitivity that may or may not, or will not change. It can change in the environment and how safe we are and all those, but kind of like our baseline doesn't change. But then there's this whole piece of nurture, right? Where it's what I would call from an IFS perspective are uh, the way that our parts have taken on roles and burdens and patterns to protect us, right? So we've had experiences with our caregivers, our friends, and people in our environment, our culture, right? And we, because of maybe our temperament, then we respond by developing these structures in our personality that help us survive, um, socially or otherwise, right? And These, though, are not things that we are born with. They are things that our parts take on, that we develop over time in our experiences. So in IFS, they would actually be called our burdens, right? The strategies that our parts take on, whether it's perfectionism or people pleasing or numbing in a certain way, dissociating or working really hard, um, performing and being really hypervigilant about our appearance or our environment or other people, or maybe being really strong and cold and aggressive, or, whatever those things are, people perceive that as our personality. And it is deeply ingrained. I do agree that, what did it say? It said relatively stable and enduring, that for many or most people, these structures, these patterns that we learn early on that help protect us do endure because many, many people don't do the inner healing work, right? So it is kind of rare for that to change, but it is possible, in my opinion and in my experience. And so um, I started looking up, some of the big measurers of personality. For example, the Myers-Briggs, the Enneagram, the Big Five. Those are probably the three biggest that many people know about. And so I thought about, the Myers-Briggs, it has introversion versus extroversion, sensing versus intuiting, which is really about being more detail oriented or more big picture oriented, feeling versus thinking, and then judging versus perceiving, which is often described as judging as more very organized and attached to schedules and rigid in that way, whereas perceiving is a lot more spontaneous and open to move here and there. Um, and in my experience with the Myers-Briggs, I first took it when I was in college, and I felt safe and I felt belonging. I had a lot of my needs met at that time in my life. And so I tested more extroverted, which is really interesting to me, because now I would consider myself an introvert. So it feels like that changed a little bit, at least in my presentation over time. Um, Sensing and intuiting for me, uh, I believe I've mainly tested as an intuiting, as an N. I do typically see the big picture and how things are integrated and kind of make sense together. I put things together. Sometimes I can be oblivious to specific details. Um, but when I really care about something and I'm honed in on it, I'm very aware of all the details, right? So it can kind of shift depending on how safe I feel, depending on what I'm focused on, right? And then thinking and feeling, my feeling always tipped um, thinking, but I feel like when I understand myself from an IFS perspective, I have a lot of really intellectual thinking parts and I have a lot of really big feeling parts. So kind of pitting them against each other is also a bit problematic for me, because I think there can be a spectrum or a percentage. And again, it depends on the moment and what parts are front facing in that moment. And part of the reason why I always said, sometimes I would say that my Myers-Briggs was XX big F X, because I had really big feelings and emotions that, as hard as some of my parts tried to suppress and shame and belittle, I couldn't get rid of them. They couldn't get rid of those emotions. That's part of my neurosensitivity, my high sensitivity. And those emotions, because I had such big emotions that I could not get rid of, I was like, I'm a big F, but I was kind of introvert, extrovert was tied, sensing, intuiting was tied, judging, perceiving was tied. But I most often uh, tested as judging, because I do seem, and this does seem as I talked to my parts, they explained to me that, and this is a bit of a burden, but that because early in my life, it felt like I couldn't predict what other people wanted of me. It made my system feel really more safe to kind of know what to expect and to not be blindsided by someone being upset with me or me doing the wrong thing. And so it felt like if I could just predict what was happening and be really organized in that way, schedule wise, or just know what's coming, which you can't always do, I would just feel more secure and more safe with that. And a lot of people, especially who are neurosensitive, feel that way. And yet it's not an innate part of being neurosensitive. It's a result of being neurosensitive in a culture that is more neurotypical, and those hypervigilant parts around let me figure out what other people want. And this might be a little bit of a jump ahead, but I've realized recently that a big part of my perfectionism persona was not actually that I or parts of me wanted things to be perfect for me so that I felt safe, essentially. But it was more that they wanted them to be perfect according to the person in front of me. So I wanted whoever was in front of me, it didn't matter who they were. My system wanted to feel safe and know, okay, I know what they want from me and I can give it to them so that I am safe socially with them. So there was a hypervigilance around figuring out what that person wanted. And that's why when I was in an environment with a lot of people, it was incredibly overwhelming because inevitably what they wanted from me might be competing, right? And so I felt my system felt pulled in this direction. Wait, but if I do what they want and I'm perfect for them, then I'm not perfect for this person, right? And I'm failing and falling short, and now they're upset with me. And so that was really overwhelming. One of the most stressful things for me was hosting big groups in my home because there were parts who felt responsible that I had to please everyone who came into my home. And inevitably, they were pleased by different things. And my system really felt like I had to please the person in front of me or I would die. And this stemmed from early childhood of feeling like I've got to assess what people want from me or else. Um, so so again, those are strategies. That's more on this side of the parts that actually can be unburdened and can change. Okay, so but I do identify in many ways as an INFJ. And I was just a side note here, if you identify as an INFJ or you know an INFJ, a majority of INFJs identify as fours on the Enneagram, not all, but most. And I watched a video recently where a woman was saying that there have been studies that she claims all um, autistic people, I don't know if it's just autism level one or across the board, but or maybe all neurosensitive people are INFJs. Or no, she didn't say that. She said all INFJs are autistic or neurosensitive. Interesting. Interesting to consider. Um, and maybe again, it's a configuration of how we naturally are and how our systems have developed around keeping us safe for that reason. Okay, so then the Enneagram, if you're not familiar with the Enneagram, Ennea means nine. So there are nine personality types, and they are the one is the reformer, the two is the helper, the three is the achiever, the four is the individualist, the five is the investigator, six is the loyalist, seven, the enthusiast, eight, the challenger, and nine, the peacemaker. Okay, so um, for the longest time, I identified as an Enneagram 1, which is called the reformer, and some people will call it the perfectionist. And what I realized was that this was a whole construct several of my parts, it involved huge inner critics that really beat me up if I didn't meet the expectations of people outside of me. And of course, also a whole people pleasing team, all the hypervigilant parts around detecting what does the person or people in front of me want me to do, and just this desperation of I must do it or else. And it was a really it caused a lot of suffering in my system because part of that whole structure was these varying levels of inner critics that maxed out at suicidal parts, or what I call murderous parts, right? That were saying, if you don't do the right thing, the perfect thing, according to the person in front of you, you deserve to die. You might as well die, right? And so there was so much pain every time I would fall short or someone in front of me would express any level of criticism about me, like, why didn't you do it this way? Don't you know that you should do things this way? You fell short here, you failed. Any kind of message like that was so crushing to my system that there were then other parts that wanted to just take me out of any kind of possibility of being scrutinized, um, and hide and not show up at all. And then there were the parts who were just, we can't not be around anybody, so we've got to be hyper vigilant and make sure that we're doing whatever the person in front of us thinks is perfect. And it's funny because I had a daughter-in-law who would come over to my house and she would say, "You're an Enneagram 1. Your house does not look like an Enneagram 1." Because I think she had this expectation that I would be completely neat and organized and perfect, clean in my home. But I've also always struggled with kind of a spatial judgment, and I've never had a real sense of particularity around like how things need to look on my external environment. So I used to say, I'm not an external one, I'm an internal one. All the scrutiny and all the perfectionism is turned in toward me and my behavior and my the way that I show up in the world to make sure that I don't offend people or get them upset in any way. And that felt very, very threatening to me. And I realized again, this is parts that developed this around being neurosensitive um, early in life. And they were trying to help me survive socially. And that it really did feel like death early on. Okay. So as I started healing these parts, the inner critics, and even just recently, them accepting that I'm neurosensitive, neurodivergent, and that's just how, this temperament side, this nurture side of my brain, my body, and my nervous system, this is how I was born, this is how I am, that they can't force it out of me, they can't kill it out of me, right? They have relaxed more, right? And so I don't have all the incessant inner critics, and I have more of a sense of ease and a sense of showing up in a good enough way. And just saying, you know what, I can't please every person in front of me. I can't do things the way this person does them or that person does them, whether other people or my parts perceive that those people are perfect and they're doing it the right way. Sometimes I don't have the skills or the capacity to do those things. And so my system is much more relaxed, much more um, uh, okay showing up, on these videos, right? There's, I don't edit anything because I don't have skills of editing. I don't know how to do it, right? So if I have little things here and there where I'm rambling or there's something, there's a distraction, I'll keep it in the video because I don't know how to do those things, right? I don't know how to, I'm not great with technology. And if I waited until I totally knew technology and I was perfect with technology to show up, I just wouldn't show up. So, a lot of my self-paced courses and things, maybe the camera or the audio is not perfect. I don't have the best aesthetics on my social media, a part says, right? But who's to determine, right, what is perfect or what is right? It is very individual, and so I'm just showing up the best that I can, and I feel okay with that. And that's very different than, for example, I showed up when I was in school. I felt like I had to be perfect. This was the way that I had got accolades and I got approval, right? Was to get straight A's and to show up. But I was really overriding my own capacity. I ended up having mental breakdowns, physical illnesses, chronic pain, all these different things because my parts kept overriding my own capacities and were just so, um, felt like it was life or death to do that, to be as perfect as possible, right? And so now my system has it's kind of, some of my parts have swung to another extreme where there's like an aversion response to any pressure from the outside of someone to say what my parts perceive as perfect, right? You need to change this, do that. And I'll say, find that perfect somewhere else because I don't, my system's like, I don't want to go back there. I don't want to be that anymore. Um, and again, it's not the person in front of me's fault for wanting something or for asking for it, but my system can have a bit of a pushback, and say, no, we're done with that. We don't want to do that anymore. So, I would say a couple years ago or so, as I began to just live into, like Martha Beck says, following my body compass, following what delights me, allowing myself to be as I am and to be authentic. I realized I am highly sensitive. I have really big emotions. I actually am creative. I really appreciate nature and aesthetics. And these are not burdened parts. This is when my parts are unburdened, what they gravitate toward. And that sits me a little bit more in the Enneagram 4 camp. And so now I'll kind of identify as that, even though, again, with the Enneagram, it's so interesting. If you read some of the deeper literature about the Enneagram, what they'll say is your Enneagram number is actually who you are not. And so they're actually saying the same thing that I'm saying here. That what your Enneagram number tells you, and it's a very, very valuable information, is actually tells you your configuration of the strongest protective parts that are facing outward for you, right? So if you're an Enneagram 1, you're going to have those hypervigilant parts around making everything organized or perfect around you. And that somehow has kept you safe. That is a burden that some of your parts have. If you are an Enneagram 2, you've learned that to keep yourself safe, you've got to caretake other people and you've got to be hypervigilant around other people's needs and take care of them. If you are an Enneagram 3, you've learned that I've got to show up and perform and, look well put together for other people. And that's how I survive. Or maybe that's how I protect against the vulnerability underneath, right? In Enneagram 4, perhaps there's I I don't know, I'm just thinking this now. I have parts that are saying an Enneagram 4 more has some of their exiles on the surface, that they are feeling really deeply and allowing that to be seen and okay in that. And a lot of other people don't like that, and some people do. But maybe they've learned that protects them or helps them in some way. And Enneagram 5 has learned that if I just research and I just have knowledge and I just know enough about things, that'll protect me. And Enneagram 6 has learned that if I'm loyal and I follow all the rules and I am in the right group, that will protect me. Sevens have learned that, maybe I just don't want to turn toward any of the painful things, the exiles, if you will, in my life. And so I'm just going to pursue the next biggest, most exciting thing and keep myself happy, right? And seek these might be some sensation seeking parts as well. And then the 8 has learned that I'm going to be strong and I'm going to push back on people, and I'm going to, you know, be assertive. And that's how I survive, right? And the nine has learned that if I am the peacemaker, if I just make sure that I'm keeping peace between people outside of me and between me and other people and keeping the peace inside of me, then those exiles won't come up, right? So these are all protective strategies. And when we learn what our Enneagram number is, it's really valuable because then we can turn toward those parts and recognize and appreciate how they had to work really hard to protect us and to maybe keep down the vulnerable parts of us. But when our self can go to them and be led, gain their trust and be led to the vulnerable parts they protect, and then those parts are healed, those big protective parts that are facing outward can relax a little bit more. And then what I think happens is once our parts, I think we all kind of have parts that are in all nine of those numbers. And they're just, some of them are more dominant than others or more active than others. And as we heal, they become more balanced and we have access to all of them. And we can at times be really spontaneous and, pursue exciting things like a seven. And at other times we can be an improver, but not in a burdened state. We can say, oh, this thing, like Callie was telling me, this thing that I want to add to my life really helps me in the long run and supports my system. And so I want to do it, but not because I need to be perfect or else, right? So all of them can be like that. So I do think that once we heal and once we are self-led, um, none are taking over, none are extreme, or they might take over at times, right? And the self can get curious about what their fear is. Um, And I'll just say really quickly the big five are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And I would say the same is true, that some of these can be ways that we have learned to show up in order to protect ourselves. And I remember when Brian was telling me when he first took the Myers-Briggs test, that he was essentially answering the questions in a way that he believed. I think he might have been applying for a job at the time, the way he believed that someone who would have that job would answer the questions, or the way that the employers would want him to answer the questions. So sometimes, even when we take a personality test, it really is our masks, right, that are showing up. It's the ways that we perceive that we should show up in the world, or other people want us to show up in the world, or just how we show up in order to protect ourselves, right? Um, so, a big root of how we show up to protect ourselves is the traumas that we've had, or the attachment wounding early in our lives, or perhaps the conditioning of the culture and their family around us. We learn how to survive and we develop those patterns. But what if, as adults, we could deprogram those patterns? Not all of them, if they're helping us, right? But if they're not helping us anymore, if they're extreme, if they're causing conflict in our relationships or causing illness in our bodies or depression or unhappiness, because our protective parts have just always been doing this job in this way, and that's all they know how to do, but it doesn't make sense in our lives now, right? So what if we could gently question them, or know that they're doing that for a reason and that they make sense and they're trying to protect us, but can we go to the ones that they protect? So we could ask those parts, right? Who, let's say, an Enneagram 2, who is desperately caretaking other people, and we can ask those parts, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't caretake this person in front of me? And just be open and listen, right? And they might say, that person will die. And you could say, oh, when did that happen? When did someone die and you blamed yourself that you didn't take care of them enough? And then can I go back to that moment and be with the part of you that's stuck in that moment, that holds that burden, the weight of that responsibility. And then we can time travel back and witness them and, you know, give them that felt sense of that they're not alone in it, and reflect to them that it's not their fault, and they can unload that guilt and that responsibility. And then once those parts are able to do that, they don't feel that urgency anymore in your real life, right? To that I have to caretake people or else. But they have to have that disconfirming experience, right? They have to be healed by the self in that way. But there is a way to do that, right? And then they do show up differently. So I just said here, inner healing can allow us to be more authentic, removing our masks, unburdening parts who learned patterns that kept us safe, releasing cultural and legacy burdens from our conditioning. And then we may look like a totally different person. Um, let's see, I already talked about a lot of this. Um, yeah, I remember several years ago when I was really big in the Enneagram, and I was following the holistic psychologist, Nicole LePera, and she started reading a book on the Enneagram. And I was so excited. I thought, oh, she's going to get on board with this. And she read it and she said, I appreciate it, but I don't think that our personality is fixed. I think that it is something that can change with inner healing, with self-healing. And at the time, I was a little skeptical. I thought, well, but I am also open to the experience of things and experimenting with things. And again, over time in my own experience, I had the experience of it. And then that's when I agreed with her. And so if you're listening to what I'm saying and you're like, I don't know, I don't expect you to disbelieve what I'm saying. That would be irresponsible. Um, what I would hope is that you would just experiment and experience and observe yourself. And as you do your own inner healing, again, there's no right or wrong, right? And your parts will often tell you, oh, this is a quality that is just who I am. That's not going to change. And other times you'll get a sense that this is an urgent, burdened pattern, right? And it's not working for the parts anymore, and they're tired of doing it. And you can give them hope that they can actually rest from those jobs. Um, yeah, I said that our coping mechanisms essentially can change. It is rare, but it can happen. Our nature part does not change, but our nurture part can change, or the nurture part of our personality can change. And a lot of times when we do inner healing and we do change, in essence, this can cause a lot of struggle in our relationships, because if we're in relationship with people who depended on us being their caretaker, kind of being codependent, um, or being the strong, assertive one, or whatever it was that our role was, essentially, when we stop having that role because we realized that it was extreme and that it was taking a toll on us, other people don't know what to do, because they're like, this was like the contract, this was the agreement. I think someone made the analogy of you're in a play, right? And you're playing certain roles and you have your scripts and you play them over and over again, especially in families, but it can be other relationships too. And then suddenly when you go off script and you realize, oh, I don't like this character that I'm playing. I don't like this script and what they're saying. I'm going to say something different. I'm going to behave differently. The rest of the characters go, where's my cue? I don't know what to do anymore. And so sometimes they'll have a lot of backlash and trying to bring you back into the script, back into the play in the way that you were before, because it's so uncomfortable for them. And sometimes other people can adjust, if they're healthy and self-aware, and we can maintain relationships that evolve and grow together. And other times the other person's parts just cannot adjust. And we realize that their parts are treating, are harming ours, their protective parts. And And inevitably, there is distance or separation, which can be really painful, and there can be a lot of grief around it. But hopefully, on the other side, we find people in a new play, or not even a play, just a living life, adjusting and being, and allowing each other to be and to be different in different scenarios. Um, and we kind of find a new tribe that accepts us as we are in our authenticity. So I do think that as we heal, we become more and more authentic. We become more attuned to our own emotions, our physical capacities, our nervous systems, and they guide us toward what's life-giving to us in any given moment and toward when our needs are unmet. And we just begin listening to that, and we can flow more with it, rather than being in a rigid role, right? That's kind of more unconscious. We're more present. Um, and yeah, so let me know what you think about that. Let me know if you have any questions about it, or share with me your experiences. Do you feel like there are certain aspects of your quote unquote personality that have changed over time as you have done inner healing? Um, and maybe there are parts that like want you to change certain things that they think are bad. But let them know that those won't change until whatever they're protecting is healed, or the environment and relationships around you are safe enough for them to do that. So there's no urgency to change or do anything differently. It's just to be able to be with what is and to listen to the messages, because everything makes sense in any given moment. So, all right. Thank you so much for listening to this. If you have listened thus far, um, you can put in hmm, something that relates to personality. So you might put what you have tested as a on the Myers-Briggs, if you're a ENFP or an INTP or an INFJ or whatever it is, you can put that. If you know your Enneagram number, you can put that. If you know your big five configuration, you might put that, or any other, there's other personality types too. You can put whatever kind of you feel like has represented your personality. And again, something that is doesn't have to be fixed, right? But whatever represents that to you or has in the past. Okay, may you be kind to yourselves, to every part of you who is the way it is, or has worked so hard and created patterns and strategies to protect you. May you give love and understanding to all of them. May you be kind to them until we meet again. See you next time.